Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. Today's topic is the chemtrail conspiracy theory. For the past few days, me and my brother have been researching into this topic, and hopefully by the end of the video you can learn something. Alright, let's begin. So now for the introduction of the video, we're basically going to discuss what the chemtrail conspiracy actually is. Yeah, and what the theorists that come up with this idea actually believe, because there's a lot of confusion in the mainstream media because of all the different opinions put out there. So right now, before we get into anything, we're just going to establish what that is. So the chemtrail conspiracy, in a nutshell, is basically the government is using planes to release chemical trails in the air for climate modification and for population control. So if you've seen these white trails of cloud-looking things that planes leave behind, the government's official story for what this is, what the theorists are calling chemtrails, are actually contrails. So contrails, the term, is short for condensation trails. So now I'm just going to explain to you what contrails are. First of all, let's just start with the basics. Contrails are present 25,000 feet to 40,000 feet, which is the typical aircraft cruising altitude, so where planes typically fly. Contrails are composed of primarily water in the form of ice crystals. If you didn't know, clouds are made of water droplets. Aircrafts leave behind these condensation trails because of the exhaust gases and soot pollution particles. So soot is just a term for, it's a type of pollution particle, meet with the cold air up to negative 60 degrees Celsius and create water vapor in the shape of ice crystals, contrails, in brackets. So basically what they're saying is that these chemtrails, they're contrails, and these contrails are basically formed when the moisture that the engines of the planes create condense in the cold air, forming a cloud, because that's how clouds are formed. So pretty much they're just saying these contrails are made of water and there are no chemicals whatsoever. So that's the official description of a contrail. So now I just want to go into a bit more depth on how these contrails are actually formed. So as you know, a plane's turbine engine is very hot and produces a lot of heat. And the regular cruising altitude for these planes are much higher up, so they're around 40,000 feet in the air, which means it's a lot colder, specifically up to negative 60 degrees Celsius, which is very cold. And as you know, the atmosphere is full of water vapor or moisture. And basically, the hot air from these engine turbines hit the cold air of the atmosphere, and it condenses the water vapor into ice crystals, which is what contrails is actually made of. And contrails aren't actually the same. There are many different contrails. Sometimes you may see these contrails basically in the air for a number of different time lengths. Sometimes you see it for only 30 seconds. Sometimes you see it for a few minutes. And sometimes you see it for up to a few hours, or maybe even the whole day. So the reason for these contrails staying in the air for a different amount of times is because of the humidity of the atmosphere. When there is more humidity and more water vapor in the air, it is easier for the plane, basically the turbine engine, to fuse with the air because it's more humid and produce a thicker contrail. The thicker the contrail is, the longer it'll stay up. And it also depends on how much wind there is in the air, because they might fade away much faster if there's a lot more wind. But if there's no wind to spread it out and push it away, it's most likely going to stay there longer. Just another variable. The contrail that stays in the air for the least amount of time is called the short-lived contrail. These contrails appear as short white lines following behind the aircraft. So basically, it'll disappear in the time the plane leaves your sight. So up to a few minutes, it'll stay in the air. So these are less thick because they're usually found in atmospheres with a small amount of water vapor for the plane's engine to basically create a contrail. The second shortest living contrail is called the persistent non-spreading contrail. This type of contrail is presented as a long white line, same as the other, that stays visible in the sky long after the aircraft has passed. So basically up to an hour, these contrails stay in the air. They are seen in wet and humid conditions because the higher levels of water vapor in the air from the contrail, higher levels of water vapor in the air make it easier to form a contrail. The only other type of contrail is called a persistent spreading contrail. This type of contrail is formed identically to the non-spreading variant of this contrail. However, the spreading occurs due to unstable or turbulent air mass. So this means basically winds that can push these contrails and spread them out. This is why we see these contrails. They kind of look like weird, strange, spread out clouds. This is all off the NASA website. This is their claims for the different types of contrails. So we just talked about contrails. Now let's talk about some things that people confuse for contrails. So something that people confuse for contrails is the wingtip vortex, also known as wingtip vortices. So these are not contrails. They are visible coming from the wingtips and basically look like thin variations and light or not thick variations of a contrail. So how it works is it usually happens when a plane takes off or lands because of sudden changes in air pressure. Because how wingtip vortices work is basically they are circular patterns of rotating air and are generated by lift. When you take off or land, there is lots of lift, and that's how these become visible. Basically, they speed up, and that's how they're visible, and specifically in cold and humid environments, because I guess the cold freezes the particles of the air and makes them visible to the eye. So that's just a short description on wingtip vortices. These are not contrails. They're just another variation of a trail coming from a plane. Now let's talk about fuel dumping. This is another thing that people are known for confusing with contrails or chemtrails because it does look very suspicious. It happens at high altitude, and basically it's when planes need to reduce weight for landing in case there is something wrong, and they basically need to be as light as possible. They dump their excess fuel, for a safer landing, and this happens out of a separate nozzle, and that's how a lot of people confuse this for chemtrails because it looks like it's not coming from the exhaust, and that's how people essentially get confused. So another thing people rarely get confused with, but you may just want to know about this, is basically exhaust smoke. In this video, you can see there's a gray chemtrail-like or contrail-like substance coming from the exhaust of the plane. This is just the turbine of the plane basically burning fuel and creating this. This sometimes happens if it's maybe not clean fuel, or just this is very common in planes that they burn fuel and it's visible to see the smoke from it. These are not contrails. Now, pesticides. This doesn't look like any of the clips I've showed you, as it is a completely different plane. It's not a high flying plane. It is for farms and spraying pesticides. If you got to call anything chemtrail, I guess you could call this a chemtrail, as you're literally spraying chemicals onto things, essentially poisoning them from a plane. These aren't the chemtrails that we are referring to today, but these are chemicals being sprayed from a plane. And if you haven't really gone into chemtrails and contrails, you may think this is it. So this isn't just another variation of spraying chemicals from a plane. So now we've established what the conspiracy on chemtrails are, and we've also established what contrails are. We've established the different things that people mistake for contrails. So now let's get into some interesting things. Now we're going to talk about some of the opinions on chemtrails and not just what the mainstream pursue this conspiracy to be. Yeah, we're going to show you an expert that had an interview with the Channel 10, which is an Australian news. It was a debate channel. It was sort of like a debate, like a 10-minute video, and he basically says evidence, and he advocates some important points on why he basically believes this theory. So we'll just play it for you now. Hopefully you enjoy.
Well, have you heard the theory that we're all being bombarded with a cocktail of chemicals from on high? The allegation is that those white vapour trails in the sky left by aircraft are evidence of a government weather modification cover-up, and in the process we're all being slowly poisoned. So is this a baseless conspiracy theory or something sinister that we should be taking seriously? Joining us live from California is one of the most well-known advocates of what is loosely called the chemtrails theory, Dane Wigington, and to challenge him from Australian skeptics, Ken McLeod, a retired air traffic controller. Morning to you both. Dane, I'll start with you. What proof do you have that chemtrails are happening and that they are for climate engineering?
First, I would start with the fact that we at geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest website in the world on the subject, don't recognize the chemtrails term. Semantics is important because if people search that term, they find conspiracy theory and hoax by design. So we advise sticking to the climate science terms: climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management. In regard to the proof we have, in addition to having government documents, Senate documents, presidential documents, we have U.S. Air Force former generals, 2 former generals communicating with us. We have NASA satellite imagery like that, which you're showing right now, that clearly no one needs to know anything about meteorology to see that there's very unnatural patterns in those cloud formations. In fact, patterns that nature cannot make. In addition to our testing of precipitation from around the globe, which has yielded without exception the climate engineering components in the precipitation: aluminum, barium, strontium, polymer fibers. We have just at great expense and great effort completed atmospheric testing using a flying laboratory that NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also uses, and we have just confirmed the same climate engineering elements that were emitted from aircraft in a layer that we flew through. We have just confirmed this, first type of its test ever. This is a court admissible type of evidence. I could go on, but the bottom line, in addition to all this, we have film footage of these aircraft at altitude turning on and off. You can't turn condensation on and off with the nozzles visible. As you see in that particular image you're showing now, you can see the nozzles on the wings. We have up-close photographs as well. If people don't believe what they see with their own eyes, I think there's not much we can show them.
Well, Dan, just sort of pulling back from that really sort of specific detail, why a good test of any sort of theory goes back to Cicero. Who benefits? Why would the government be using aeroplanes to poison its own population or change the climate? It seems like a very convoluted and inefficient way, for one thing, of doing anything. And why would they want to do it anyway and then cover it up?
First, in regard to your stated objective of poisoning the population, you said that, I didn't.
Okay.
That's not what we have stated at geoengineeringwatch.org. In regard to engineering the climate, I'll answer in their words. Militaries around the globe, starting with the U.S. military, state emphatically and on the record that the greatest national security threat of all is the climate collapse. What we face is far worse than global warming. We face what's more scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. The stated scientific purpose, and by the way, we have every science institution, every climate science institution around the globe discussing exactly what we see in our skies as something that needs to be done immediately to spray light scattering particles into the sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. Yeah. So this is the stated purpose of solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement, to spray light blocking particles into the sky. And in fact, that's what got me into this issue. I have a background in solar energy. I formerly worked for Bechtel Power, the world's largest engineering firm. I have a fully off-grid home that was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine, and I was losing extraordinary amounts of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting. And clearly, condensation cannot block that much of the sun. So we knew there was a problem. We began testing, and we were astounded at the amount of data that was available that official sources were not discussing. And by the way, they're not discussing it because in one case, we have a federal gag order, an illegal federal gag order in the U.S., gagging all the nation's weathermen. I think we should ask ourselves why that's going on.
All right. Well, Ken McLeod from Australian Skeptics, I'll bring you in here. You're a retired air traffic controller. What do you make of these theories?
Well, like in any conspiracy theory, a good one, there is just a germ of truth. Oh. And climate change, global warming, is a real threat to our civilization. Scientists have been discussing climate modification using aerosols and so on in the upper atmosphere. But unfortunately, conspiracy theories have latched onto this and gone further. There is no evidence that anyone is actually spraying chemicals in the atmosphere to alter the world's climate. Now, those video clips we saw were a phenomenon called aerodynamic condensation. Now, at low levels and high humidity, where there is a drop of atmospheric pressure, like over the wings or from wingtip vortices, there is a drop in temperature, and that will cause condensation. And it's very commonly seen around airports on rainy days. The chemtrails that people are talking about are the condensation trails from engine exhaust. Now, this is where we have to go back to basic high school science. If you burn a hydrocarbon, the products are carbon dioxide and water. And there's the little chemical formula there, and you'll notice that for every molecule of jet fuel, which is actually kerosene, you will get a molecule of water. So 1 tonne of jet fuel will produce roughly 1 tonne of water. Now, I've done some checking, and over the United States in any one day, about 230,000 tonnes of water are produced in engine exhaust trails. Now, that's where you get this huge mosaic of what appear to be contrails. They're actually technically defined by the World Meteorological Organization as cirrus clouds. And the persistence can vary from a few seconds to 20, 30 minutes. And that depends on the temperature and the humidity of that environment. Now, in the United States, where you have a mosaic of aircraft routes, you will get that crisscross pattern. In Australia, not so much, because mainly our busy air routes are north to south. And not only that, you won't see many of them over the major cities, because by that time the aircraft are on climb or descent, and so they're below the freezing level for condensation trails.
Ken, I'll just interrupt you, because that all sounds very plausible, doesn't it, Dane? Doesn't that make more sense than the government secretly trying to control climate change, which surely, if they'd found a way to do that, they'd be shouting from the rooftops and indeed the stratosphere?
Would they be shouting from the rooftops when we have federal gag orders and confidentiality agreements that are spoken about by the U.S. Air Force generals that we have interviewed on film and on the record? They are not at liberty to speak out about this. The liability issues are incomprehensible. The moment governments around the globe, it's not just the U.S. governments around the globe, we have Senate documents 800 pages long to prove this. The moment they've intervened in climate systems, at that point the liability issue becomes immeasurable, incalculable, because every climate cataclysm becomes suspect.
But I guess
let's cut to the chase on. If I can answer a question about the condensation trail aspect first, because this is very important in response to Ken. Ken, are you familiar with a high bypass turbofan jet engine? Are you familiar that that is the standard fitted engine on all commercial carriers and all military tankers? That engine is a jet-powered fan. 80 to 90% of the air that passes through that engine is non-combusted. By design, that engine is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail. In regard to the on-off sequences we see, the atmosphere is layered horizontally, not vertically. So this excuse that this is just some vertically layered humid conditions is ridiculous. We see researchers in the Arctic with their breath condensing. Do we see them standing around for a half hour with a big cloud hanging over their head? That's not how condensation works. Again, everything we see in the sky is exactly what is described by climate scientists. We're not asking anybody to believe us. We're asking them to look at the photographs of nozzles, film footage, government documents, statements from former military, and when we consider the degree of danger of climate collapse, would we really expect governments around the globe to ask our permission before deploying these programs, which happened in 1945, by the way, and the B-17 bombers were part of this program. We have film footage of them turning on and off too.
Well, Ken, can I ask, what are these planes if they aren't geoengineering planes?
Well, the condensation trails we see are just normal public transport aircraft. I've done some checking. At any time over the US, there's about 1,000 jet aircraft airborne. And I can give you some figures on how much water they pump out. An Airbus A330 creates about 7 tonnes of water an hour, a Boeing 787, 5.5 tonnes an hour, an Airbus A380 over 13 tonnes an hour. Now, Dane asked right at the start of his little talk, am I familiar with the high bypass turbojet engine? Of course I am. It's the standard engine that's been around since the 60s. But to say that they create less condensation trail is just not true. In actual fact, they create more of a condensation from the burnt fuel for several reasons. One is that the turbulence assists the condensation, and the other reason is these engines are generally bigger, so they burn more fuel and create more water. Now, strangely enough, I've got here an excerpt from the United States Air Service newsletter from 1921 where they wrote an article about the first observed condensation trail, an aircraft operating at 26,000 feet. And this was a complete mystery to everyone at the time because it had not been noted before. And the article goes into, well, what could be causing this? Is it carbon particles from the fuel and that sort of thing? Condensation trails are not new, and you saw that clip earlier of the B-17s operating over Germany with the Mustangs above them. At the time, pilots used to be given as part of their pre-flight briefing the expected condensation level, and it's generally around 26,000 feet. So the trick for the bombers was to operate just below the condensation level so that they could see the Messerschmitts coming in. This is nothing new. Condensation trails have been around for a long time. They're very well understood.
Can I respond to Ken?
It's
Well, I think we're out of
we
time,
are running out
Dane,
of time,
sorry.
but Dane, I am going to let people know to find out more about Dane's case, head to geoengineeringwatch.org. Dane and Ken, thank you so much for joining us and putting your cases.
So you guys just saw that video. A lot of interesting information there. See, it's once you've watched or heard the other side of the argument, you finally start thinking a lot more, because a lot of the other like videos on YouTube, for example, they watch it, they say, oh, well, it's not actually chemtrails and it's just contrails and people are mistaking it for it, and that's it. And 99% of the videos on YouTube, at least I saw, basically was saying that. But it turns out there's a lot of information, but it takes a lot of digging, like this guy has done. He says he has the biggest website for this topic, basically, and he researches a lot about it. He says he has a background in solar engineering, so he seems to know what he's talking about. Now, let's just bring up some points in the video. That's how we're going to basically go on to the next part of this investigation. So first he brings up how basically the other guy that he was talking with says, like everyone's saying, that basically that people are mistaking it and it's not chemtrails, they're contrails, and he explains how they're formed, like we've already done. And then this is when it gets interesting. So the other guy, I believe his name was Dane Wigington, something like that. I'm pretty sure that's what he is. He basically says that the standard engine, which is how the contrails are formed through the engine, basically can't actually produce these contrails. And he explains how condensation, that's not how it works. He uses the analogy that basically people have frostbite all the time. Doesn't mean they have a cloud hang above the head, you know? So I haven't looked into this. I've looked into it a bit, but he has a site with hundreds and hundreds of articles, so it's impossible to find them all. But I'll put a thing on the screen with the link, and I'll maybe put in the description. Yeah, we'll put a link in the description. We haven't gone super deep into his website, as it is full of different information and links. So if there's anything you're interested in, definitely check out that website. And this is very important for actually investigating and finding out more about this topic. So if you're truly interested, the only reason we've done this for a few days, and it's just not like a brief summary, but like basically what we found in a few days. We may make a video in the future, as always, if we decide to go deeper, which we may possibly do because are quite interesting. And basically, I felt like I could have found out a lot more in these past few days. So that's definitely a possibility in the future. Anyway, another point he makes is basically he does tests, and he did the first in-air test. So basically, he flew through a cloud. It was an in-air laboratory, so obviously on a plane, and they've from the video, I can't exactly tell how they did it, but they somehow measured basically the contents within this cloud. And the guy mentioned, the other man talking, he mentioned how they're called Cyrus Clouds. These Cyrus Clouds, they're basically these clouds, I'll put a photo on the screen now, that seem sort of more like spread out and mist-like, if you will, you know. And the reason they look like this is usually most clouds are made of water droplets and water vapor. These are made of ice crystals. So basically they're not thicker, but made of more ice crystals, which are more frozen clouds. And these can be formed through such as contrails. Now, this is the important part, and where the rest of the video will probably lead to, is he talks about not how basically it's used for pollution, but how it's for geoengineering. He mentions, because he corrects the reporter, the journalist, that says used for, you know, mind control, something like some made up reason that the mainstream's actually making seem that is basically the idea that these conspiracy theorists have, you know. But the true fact is these people are well educated and they think it's used for not population control, sorry, but weather modification, climate modification, solar engineering, all these terms that he prefers to use instead of chemtrails, because that's what they really are. And so he did this test for this cloud, and he came out with all these other chemicals like beryllium he mentioned. You can watch back in the video. I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, and he also mentions how, because they ask, like, why would the government, keep this a secret? Wouldn't they be screaming from the rooftops, And because there actually has been evidence, they don't mention this, but he says there's a gag order, a legal gag order. So basically, they're keeping confidential information from us when they're not actually allowed to release it.
Yeah, without permission. Normally, they go for court to make it confidential for a number of reasons. Maybe because of some national affairs, they can't let another country find out about it. But in this case, it was completely illegal. They just plain and simply wanted to hide it from the public.
But it's not like a small thing. It's a very big thing, like weather modification, secretly doing it behind our backs without us knowing, And they're not talking about it anywhere on the news or even like YouTube videos. It's very hard to find. You can only find like, outside sources, like smaller sources, not like these mainstream websites and news channels, So now we're going to talk about geoengineering and what he meant by that. So geoengineering, basically what geoengineering is, it is the
Control and enhance.
It's to control and enhance weather by either be able to the whole point of geoengineering basically is to solve global warming. And when they first thought of geoengineering, it was back in the 60s when they apparently first discovered that global warming was a problem and it was caused by them. And that's also when they proposed the solution of geoengineering. The first one was basically they'd spray these water not molecules, but aerosol particles into the air, and it basically would go into the clouds. This is also something called cloud seeding. It's a form of engineering climate.
So basically how cloud seeding works is they use these planes and they're called seeding agents that have pyrotechnic flares, which are basically the nozzles that spray the chemicals to do the cloud seeding process. And they spray condensation nuclei to act as additional ice crystals, making the clouds essentially thicker. So they basically spray these things that act as ice crystals, and it basically attracts the clouds, and it basically makes the clouds connect and just adds more clouds, and essentially
makes it thicker. But the reason they're making it thicker is because it's to solve global warming, supposedly. And when basically the clouds, they cover a large amount of like the sun and they deflect the sun. So they thought if they'd add these particles to the clouds and make them thicker, in simple terms, it would basically deflect it more. That's why when you see stormy clouds or rain clouds, they're very dark because barely any light's getting through. So they made them thicker so less light gets through the clouds, making less sun radiation come down to Earth,
But the people that say these are chemicals, not just like the alternatives for the ice crystals to make the cloud. They say it's chemicals because I'm not sure if it was in this video of Dane Wigington. It might have been in another video me and my brother watched of him. He says that chemicals, basically they're chemical clouds and not just normal looking clouds, because it says condensed water, which is clouds, basically can't block that much of the sun, so they're using chemicals.
Yeah, okay. And now I just want to read you a little thing I wrote down. I can't remember off the top of my head, so I'm going to read it. Or basically, Bill Gates, as you can see here on the front screen, basically in 2008 he got like a patent to do all this thing. So I'm just going to read it out for you. Another person you may know is the so-called philanthropist Bill Gates. Recently in 2019, funded the first high-altitude experiment, they say, of one of the radical approaches called solar engineering towards global warming, which they make seem like a new approach to solve global warming. It's meant to mimic the effects of a giant volcano eruption. If you didn't know, a giant volcano eruption basically sends tons and tons of ashes into the sky, and these ashes deflect the sun's heat. That's why they call it. That's why they say mimic the eruption of a volcano. The way this works basically is the sulfurous gases combine with water in the atmosphere to form acidic aerosols. This is what they're spraying that also absorb incoming solar radiation and scatter it back into space. So it's deflecting it, and it basically makes it push back up into space. They plan to do this by sending thousands of planes to fly at high altitudes, spraying millions of tons of particles around the planet to create a massive chemical cloud that would cool the surface. So you may have heard of this in the recent months. That's why I was quite excited to this topic, because I already heard a few things, so it made me interested into this topic. The thing is, Bill Gates isn't new to this field, because in 2008, him and 12 other investors patented and trademarked a number of methods to control and prevent hurricanes. It's kind of weird how Bill Gates is involved in all these weird things. You know, he was the creator of Microsoft, but randomly he becomes into vaccines, and now, you know, like hurricane control, controlling hurricanes and
geoengineering. And when we said he got the patent to block the sun with those clouds, we didn't mean 2008, we meant 2019. He got the patent for the hurricane modification in 2008.
There's also something called cloud seeding, like we said, and I just want to mention that the U.S. government and military have been open about this. So on the news interview, they were saying basically how it's a new thing, but cloud seeding has been been like an open thing for quite a long time, and military people have just like said it casually, not like it's confidential or anything, that they remember, you know, flying and they had to do this cloud seeding. You know, it is like known fact, but you know, they don't go telling everyone about it. So in a way, it's still very secret, because you probably never even heard they could do this, and without your permission, they're pretty much just spraying things into the sun, into the sky, you know, without us knowing. Like I said, this has been for a very long time, and the first experiments of cloud seeding go back to all the way 1946, which is World War II, by American chemist and meteorologist Vincent J. Schaefer. So as you can see, this issue links to global warming, which also has quite a bit of skepticism around it, which is kind of strange. And the thing is, basically all these solutions they say is for global warming, but basically the theorists, they say basically it's for, you know, an agenda to control us, you know, and basically to do whatever God knows, you know. So that's what makes it very interesting. And the thing with genetic engineering, it's also geoengineering. They're basically, it's almost like playing God, you know. People say we've already messed with the earth so much, you know, we don't know what the consequences could be, which obviously I agree with. And I don't think we should touch it because we don't know close to enough. Like, that's in human nature. We always think we know enough, but we never know enough, and bad stuff seems to happen.
So we basically know that this geoengineering is very skeptical, and there's a lot of confusion around it and what the government could potentially be doing, whether it's spraying chemicals, and what the agenda of the spraying chemical is, what the effect is.
But for one thing, we do know is that there has been geoengineering that we're not informed by, and they're hiding from us. So we don't know exactly what they're doing it for and the specifics, but we know there's something up. So maybe what they meant about chemtrails is less about, you know, spraying chemicals in the sky to poison us. And the thing is, a lot of people that basically rebut this theory say that it's if the chemicals were sprayed that high, you know, 30,000 feet in the air, it would just evaporate by the time it got even close to the ground.
So they say if they were trying to poison us through chemicals like that, it would be more effective in water, specifically like drinking water.
And there is a lot of also collusion around that, so that might be a possible video in the future.
So that guy, Dane Wigington, he has a lot of information on the geoengineering that we haven't had enough time to go super deep in. So you should, if you want to find more about the geoengineering, like the effects and what the actual plans are, like the documents, we haven't pulled up that many documents, only basically the Gag Order and maybe some other documents we read.
But we'll leave a link to his website, which is actually very good. I went there myself. He has like an hour-long video. You can watch it there. So basically, this is just reporting what we found and basically just putting things connecting the dots, you know.
So this video has kind of been all over the place. Hopefully it's not too messy and hard to understand.
We did get around half the time to research this topic as compared to the last one, and it's a much more complex topic though.
So in this video, we've talked about the conspiracy. We've talked about contrails. So that Dane Wigington guy, he doesn't believe contrails are even real. So we know how basically how a lot of scientists say they're formed, and we've had Dane. I haven't got into much information on how he talks about how they can't be formed. As I said, check his website. You can find how he talks about that more.
But some evidence to back up his point is he showed clips of people, of the plane, spraying and like stopping and spraying, which obviously can't happen with condensed trails because that's not on purpose. It's just depending on conditions. And he also talks about on how like not all planes have it and conditions wouldn't play such a massive factor. So that's very interesting. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Hopefully you learned a bit and it inspired you to maybe research more, because that's more what this video is. Thank you for watching and see you next time.